Hello again and welcome back to the second roundtable. My name is Zainab, so I'm chairing this session. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Shauna McKinnon, Dr. Hetty Blades, Professor James Keevan, and Professor Gordon Crawford. This second roundtable is focusing on the practices of decolonizing research through participatory methodologies. And we have 4 sets of questions which we expect the participants, the presenters to answer. So first I will allow them to introduce themselves and then I'll say the questions.
Hi there. So I'm Shauna McKinnon and I'm from the city of Winnipeg in central Canada, and I work at the University of Winnipeg, which is a small university situated in the inner city.
Hi, I'm Hetty Blades. I'm an assistant professor in the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry University in the UK.
So I'm James Keevan Kewi. I'm with the African Leadership Centre, and I'm in charge of the Central African Hub, but I'm also research lead for the Faculty of Law and Political Science in the University of Boya.
Hello again, everyone. I'm Gordon Crawford from the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University.
Thank you. So thank you very much. So in thinking about how we focus on practices of decolonizing research through participatory methods and methodologies, the first question is, why should we focus more on the practice of decolonizing research through participatory methodologies? Why? I would like to ask Shauna will go first, then Hetty, then James and Gordon.
Thanks, Zainab. So it's an interesting question for me. I guess, I mean, I can only speak from the experience of the place that I do my work, and I work in the inner city of Winnipeg in a space that is a very colonized space. We have a very large Indigenous population, and if people aren't familiar, we have a fairly problematic past in terms of the treatment of Indigenous peoples in our country. So for me, who comes to this work, really comes to academia late in life, my work has been as an activist. I am not Indigenous. I feel that if our goals are social and economic justice, which are, why I came to do this particular type of research, we cannot ignore the need to participate in a process of decolonization. So for me, it's essential in achieving social and economic justice. But I also recognize the complexity of it, and I just want to say how much I appreciated the conversation, the previous panel, because I also appreciate the challenges presented to us as we try to do this work within institutions that are themselves perpetuating colonialism. So it's essential work, but it's also very challenging. So I think I'll just leave it at that and pass it on to the next person.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. I think there's many things to say in response to this question, and I'll try and stick to time. I'm going to focus my answers today on 2 projects that I've been involved in Sri Lanka, and both of these were partnerships between researchers in UK universities and an association called Visibility, which is the Sri Lankan German association, and they work on combining mixed abled dance, which is dance where disabled and non-disabled people dance together, with human rights education. And during the project, people who took part took dance and rights workshops with Visibility, and these resulted in public performances. So just to give you a kind of bit of context and background into the work that I'm going to mostly be talking about today. I think it's really important to acknowledge that both of the projects could have gone further in terms of thinking about decolonization, and also in terms of the role of the people taking part in shaping the research. And I'm quite cautious in a way about making claims about what we've achieved in these regards, but we were reflecting on these issues throughout the project. So I'll talk briefly now about a few approaches that we took, which will hopefully show something about why the areas are important to focus on. And I think one of the main reasons for this focus is to try and kind of foreground the needs of the people taking part and try as much as possible to think about the research process as something that's serving the people who are involved. So one thing we did through the project was adapt our methods in order to suit the context, and as we understood more about the needs of the people who were participating. And an example of this is that we started with an idea about how we might measure self-esteem using a kind of predetermined scale and asking participants to indicate how they felt about certain kind of ideas using a participatory game format. And this really didn't work for various reasons we realized really early on, including people feeling shy about doing this in front of others. So we kind of abandoned that approach and decided to probe self-esteem in a much more qualitative way, abandoning the predetermined scale that really didn't align with the way that participants were describing their feelings. And I think this is just one example, but it's kind of important to, it was important for us to kind of keep rethinking what it was that we were doing in the project in order to suit the experiences of the people involved. I can pass over there. I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you, Zainab. Let me start and then hand over to James. So James and I are collaborating at present on a research project in Cameroon, looking at in particular the role of civil society organisations in the so-called Anglophone conflict ongoing in Cameroon at the present time. We've uploaded some materials on that, but let me start with some background on the research project. It's entitled Voices from Ground Zero, and it examines the impact of the current conflict in Cameroon on the most affected civilian populations. So the conflict is between the Cameroonian military and armed separatist groups who are fighting for the independence of Anglophone Cameroon from Francophone Cameroon. It's a largely neglected conflict, and in particular, the voices of those most affected people, often living in rural areas, are rarely heard. Therefore, it's in line with a decolonizing approach to knowledge production. We seek to enable such marginalized groups to represent the world in their own terms and to present their views and perspectives on the current conflict and its impact on themselves and their communities. And we've attempted to do this through participatory methodologies, one of which is collage making. And let me pass over to James at this point.
Thank you, Gordon. This is, I'm glad that we're able to share this, and I think this question is very relevant because I should first say that when you compare participatory methodologies to others that adopt sometimes traditional methodologies or that some prefer to qualify as Western, that term I don't buy, but to say traditional methodologies, what we see is that they've tended to produce a kind of knowledge that seems to be disconnected from the realities of some of the terrains that are studied here, referring particularly to the developing world and to Africa in particular. So when we actually think that we need to focus more on participatory methodologies because they actually enable us to capture the essence of the experiences in these terrains better than other methodologies have been able to do over time, and so deconstruct the sort of power structures that we probably seek to question through our research. And this is exactly as Gordon has said, what informs the choice of methods for us. And one of those participatory methods that we use is the collage method. And we use this because, like other participatory methods of data collection, we saw that it would enable us to collaborate directly with those that are affected by this conflict, and that this sort of collaboration was necessary if the kind of action that would lead to a sustainable solution, or the kind of change that would be sustainable, could be achieved, could be the outcome of that research. So in a sense, we're saying that this methodology collage enables us to produce knowledge that is reliable because of how it's generated. It's generated through a process that is democratic and that is convenient for all who are involved in the research. That is ourselves as the researchers and the those that are involved in our research because of because of their meaning in terms of what we are studying. The other thing is that we also see that it enables us to not be limited by the problem that you would face if you didn't speak a certain language, or if there was a certain limitation in terms of language between you, the researcher, and those that you seek to actually carry out this research with. And so we didn't face this kind of barrier when we employed the collage method. And this, therefore, allows community members to play an important role in the research process because their knowledge as insiders and their lived experience is captured without a lot of difficulty. So these are the reasons, I think, why we found that collage as a participatory method was going to be advantageous to us in this particular study, and I think that so far, including from the comments that we had from the participants, we conclude that it's actually a very useful a method which produces the kind of insights that we would otherwise not have had from other more traditional methods like questionnaires, for instance.
Thank you. Very interesting perspectives. So the second question is, in what ways do you consider the use of participatory methodologies in research as a form of self-determination?
Thank you. Well, I would say that participatory methodologies are not inherently self-determining. It really depends. Participatory methods, I mean, there's a range. And so I would say that it's only going to be self-determining if participants are fully engaged throughout the process. So in identifying what it is that's being researched, shaping, the methodologies, having some sort of a control over the research process and then what is done with the research. So again, there's just such a range of participatory research that it's difficult to say that definitively it's going to be self-determining. I've often been guided, very simply by some critical urban theory research, and Peter Marcuse, the individual who's coined these terms, expose, propose, politicize. And I feel that this is what guides me in my work that I do in the community with people that I engage in research with. It's really about people identifying what are the issues that they are seeing that they feel need to be exposed. What are their ideas around what needs to be done differently, and how can we, explore those through a research process? And then what are we doing with that research to politicize and mobilize the community towards some sort of structural change, which of course is a difficult thing to do. But unless people are engaged in that process, I don't feel that it's necessarily going to be, going to be achieving any self-determination if people, again, are just passive participants in a a process that we've decided is participatory, however we've decided that, if there's not, if they don't feel somehow that they're engaged in, in sort of agents of change themselves. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So the aim of the first project, which was called Performing Empowerment, was to evaluate how the combination of dance and human rights education might lead to greater legal empowerment for disabled people in Sri Lanka. So although not directly looking at self-determination, we were interested in what participation in these workshops led to in terms of changes in people's self-esteem and self-confidence and self-advocacy. And we did find for many people that there were kind of increases in these areas through their participation in the workshops. And we don't know exactly why, or it seems there's something about the combination of dance and rights that enabled several people to develop confidence and self-esteem and lead to kind of increased self-advocacy. So for example, actively pursuing benefits and services that people had previously been denied or turned down for, and challenging unfair behaviors and unfair decisions, and also advocating for other people in their communities. But we can only kind of hypothesize in a way about what it is about these workshops that had led to these experiences for people. I think some aspects of Visibility's approach kind of lend themselves to the development perhaps of agency and advocacy. So they draw largely on creative tasks, including things like looking and copying or mirroring, where one person moves and another person kind of copies exactly as if they were looking in a mirror. So rather than teaching kind of particular steps or teaching routines of dance, it's more about creative tasks in which people make decisions about how they're moving. And other tasks asked the people who are taking part to reflect on their experiences. So one activity asked people to think about a word or a phrase that people said to them that they didn't like, and these words were used as the basis for developing movements. And this movement material, some of the movement materials, then used in the performances. So participants had a really kind of active role in the performances, and they drew on their own experiences. So we might think about these things as kind of leading to a greater sense of self-determination, self-advocacy, self-confidence, but it wasn't a kind of scientific study to try and determine those things. We're kind of hypothesizing about what it is that this methodology may have done. And we have started to unpack a little bit this relationship between kind of movement activities and rights principles in the development of a resource that we've made for practitioners coming out of the project. So for example, linking ideas around group work with collectivity, or contact work when people are dancing, touching each other with trust, to try and kind of understand a bit more about this kind of methodology. It's very interesting, very different types of research that is ongoing, but in many ways I would echo what Shauna and Hetty have had to say. And certainly I think in our case, self-determination, maybe expressing it a bit too strongly, and I wouldn't want to make that claim. In fact, the starting point is often much the opposite of a situation of self-determination. Certainly in the case of the Cameroon conflict, local populations, often poor rural civilians, have been universally adversely affected by the conflict. And this is what participants, local community members have all said to us, that the conflict affects them all. And they're often affected in violent and traumatic ways. And they have little or no influence over the situation or the conflict. The government appears determined to pursue a military solution. The armed non-state actors are fighting for secession, and civilians suffer. They can be accused of being
separatist or terrorist sympathizers, by the government forces, or alternatively of being state collaborators by the non-state armed groups. So our research is aimed at giving affected citizens the opportunity to express their views, and documenting their perspectives also enables communication of these views and experiences to various stakeholders, including national and international organizations, with the aim that such local voices can then have some bearing on dialogue and attempts to achieve conflict resolution. Therefore, I think to talk about self-determination in this context may be overly optimistic, but at least the collage making, it attempts to enable affected people's voices to be heard more than they are at present. James, please add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. I think I would add that although we do not look at self-determination here in the strict sense of it, because as Gordon says, it would be too optimistic. We can perhaps see it as the ability of people to take part in decision making, and this includes not only about what they are experiencing, but also how what they're experiencing is portrayed. And so the collage method and other participatory methods that we use were very useful in this, because we saw that actually through these methods it was possible for decisions that are arrived at to reflect the core interest of those who would have participated in the research. And we could perhaps argue that this means they have participated in the decision-making process. But at the very least, they are very involved in the decision-making process about how they contribute to the research, because collage is very self-regulatory method of expression, and people choose from what part of the board or the canvas to actually start their story. They are not told this is how you have to do it, or you have to do it like a fine artist that's trained in the university or that has experience, but they just have to express their opinion in the best way possible and in the way that they think others would be able to understand what they communicate. And so that in itself is self-determining, being able to participate or take part in research in that way. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'll lump questions 3 and 4 together. So because of time, so that we can have enough time for the question and answers. So question 3, what types of participatory methodologies facilitate the process of decolonizing knowledge? And from your experience, what are the limits of participation? Will be good to bring in some empirical examples here.
Well, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I think the methodologies that facilitate decolonizing knowledge and are the methodologies that participants themselves have had some input in choosing. So I just very much believe in the process beginning before the research starts. So it's like my research is always, I'll give an example. My research has always been driven by the community. So I don't go in with an idea of what I would like to do research on. Because of the work I do in the community, I teach in the community, I have relationships with folks in the community. It's really about dialogue around the issues that they're identifying, and then we figure out together what methodologies make sense. So I believe that is the way that you can contribute to a process of decolonization. To answer the last question, the limits of participation, again, like it really, there are many factors in terms of how participatory you're able to be. And, you know, you will all understand, you know, the challenges around time, around access to resources, all of those sorts of things are going to be critical. But again, it's also, people need to define for themselves how much they would like to participate, how much time they have to participate. People, you know, often have complicated lives, so there are limits to participation. And when you're taking it to then that level of, again, moving beyond what you're doing research on and how you're doing the research, what you're doing with the research, you know, there are some people that are more comfortable being actively engaged and then moving it forward to participate in some sort of policy change, which is what we tend to do with our research, always bringing it to that level of what can we change in terms of public policy, because those are the structures that are keeping people oppressed. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. So I'll just pick up, I guess, on what I was saying before about the kind of role of dance in the project. And I think it seems that participation in dance seems to have played an important role in the experiences of the people who took part. And I'm not suggesting that dance as a method is kind of the answer to everything. Some dance forms in particular have colonial associations. And I think Dudu in the previous session made the really important point that it's about the kind of application of the method. And I think the way that visibility worked allowed for the knowledge of the people taking part, their lived experiences to come to the foreground. And partly, as I mentioned before, that the exercises were mostly creative rather than teaching kind of set movements. So people drew on their own movement histories and own ways of moving. And then outside of the frame of the workshop, some people went on to use the kind of creative techniques they'd learned in the workshops to develop their own performances, which addressed issues from their lives. And some also ran rights information sessions in their communities. Another thing I think that was really important in the workshops is the role of group reflection. So after each activity, the group would gather together to share their experiences, how they found the task. And also these conversations led to kind of more general discussions about their daily experiences. And this was really important for kind of continually feeding back into Visibility's approach to the workshops and also our way of thinking about the research. Another kind of important aspect is that we, through the interviews and the workshops, we started to then kind of unpack these key notions such as empowerment, such as disability. And we were very aware that the design of the project at the start had to some extent imported particular kind of understandings of these notions, and interrogating the terminology with the people taking part allowed us to kind of really understand what our previous kind of understandings of these concepts were inappropriate and needed rethinking in the frame of the project. Another kind of methodological, and this also I think relates to some of the kind of limits of participation, another methodological challenge was how we tried to kind of disrupt the power dynamics between the researchers and the people taking part in the project. One thing we did in this regard was that all the researchers took part in the first part of the dance workshop. We also did things like chatting informally over breaks and regularly reiterating there's no right answer and so on. We were also able in this, particularly in performing empowerment, to build relationships over quite a long period of time. So there were 2 rounds of workshops that were 6 months apart. And then we went back another 6 months later and ran a workshop that was focused more on the development of the resource that I mentioned. And some, although not all, but some of the participants took part in all these activities who were able to gain kind of trust and develop a relationship over time. And I think this helped to some extent to overcome the kind of power dynamics, particularly our taking part in the dance workshop at the beginning. I think kind of temporarily disrupted some of those dynamics as we were all kind of encountering this new experience for the first time together. Just just one other thing to say about our methods is that in the second project in performing inclusion, the research team from the UK worked alongside 15 Sri Lankan researchers, and before the data collection began, there was a research methods exchange between the researchers. I wasn't actually part of this. I couldn't travel to Sri Lanka at that time, but just to give you an example, during this exchange, there was a discussion that occurred between the Tamil and Sinhalese speaking Sri Lankan researchers all around terminology around disability. And so the UK researchers were participant learners in this conversation, and throughout the research exchange, these roles of kind of researcher, facilitator, learner regularly switched. And in the end, a kind of significant outcome of that research exchange was that the Sri Lankan researchers redesigned the questions to suit the context as well as their own positions as interviewers. So the questions, the phrasing, the terminology were reframed and based highly on the Sri Lankan researchers' expertise. I think just to very quickly go back to the kind of power dynamics and the kind of limits of that. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, there may have been kind of moments where there was a temporary kind of disruption. But in other ways, I think this really was a kind of significant limit for us. And, you know, things, for example, like the process of going through, okay, I'm going to be very, very quick. But just for example, things about the process of going through the information sheet and the consent form and things that are critically important, of course, to get informed consent. But starting the process with all of that, starting the workshops with, you know, telling people all about the research and asking for them to kind of consider taking part in it before they'd had a chance to really get to know us. Definitely framed things in a certain way and really kind of foregrounded the research in a way that perhaps was a bit problematic. I will stop there, thank you.
This is, from me, quite a quick one. The kind of methodologies that facilitate the process of decolonizing knowledge would be those that actually enable us to ensure that those that the research involves are not left out in any way or are not being that nothing is, this research, it does not appear to be is imposed or is not does not appear to be detached from those that it actually seeks to address. So in this sense, there's a range of methods that can actually be considered to facilitate the process of decolonizing knowledge, and even some that are not even dubbed, as I think Novu said in the first panel, that are not even dubbed participatory could also be argued to be decolonizing. The devil lies in the detail. How do you apply the method? Or do you apply it effectively? Because, for instance, we have situations where if you take key informant interviews, I came across a situation where there was a study being carried out by the World Bank, and this required key informant interviews. So they had decided that there are certain people in certain communities who would provide the kind of information who were best placed to provide the kind of information that they needed. However, these people were not actually the ones providing this information. If they did, that would have produced knowledge that we could consider decolonial, or knowledge that we could consider as the result of a participatory or a democratic process, if you like. But what rather happened was that those who were supposed to implement this, so the people who were supposed to carry out this research, had a team of friends that they used to simply answer the questions for them. And then they sent back. They didn't go to the different towns where they had to meet these key informants, but the report actually showed that they had been to these towns. So the outcome of this would then most likely not reflect the reality. And we all know how World Bank policies, which are the outcome of such research, have been criticized for not addressing the key problems actually that plague Africa as an example. So if in the same way, if we look at focus group discussions, if they are applied wrongly, then they would not actually produce the kind of outcome that we expect from a participatory research. But in terms of those that I would consider better place, to decolonize knowledge, I think collage is one of them, and focus groups are really high up on the ladder. Why? Because it's actually difficult to play the kind to not meet people that you are supposed to have a focus group discussion with, as opposed to not meeting a key informant. It's difficult to imagine a situation where a focus group discussion, for instance, is faked. I haven't come across that yet. It's also difficult to imagine if a collage session that doesn't hold but that is reported to have held. Those are the kind of so these kind of methodologies that really by the way that they are operationalized, by the way that they are actually implemented, get you or force the researcher to actually do what he set out to do. Those that are better placed to ensure that you produce knowledge that can be qualified as decolonized. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, James. Just to add a little on the limits of participation, I thought it was very interesting that in the first roundtable, pretty much immediately people were talking about the limitations of participatory approaches, etc. And I think it was Latta who was asking the sort of the key questions about, who participates, how they participate, and towards what purposes, etc. And I think the limits of participation have been well documented from Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Participation, written in 1969, over 50 years ago. And I think all of us are aware that participatory methods can be used to manipulate as much as to liberate. But I think this is not to deny that participatory methods can also be used more positively and progressively, albeit with limitations. And certainly in our own research, limitations are evident. Just taking the collage making, we're only able to present the perspectives of a limited number of people. We're unlikely to reach the full range of experiences and perspectives of those affected by the conflict. We are likely to miss those who are most marginalized, rural people that remain in the conflict zones, or the displaced hiding in the bush. We're also not reaching the fighters themselves. So, and there are also limits. Those who are involved, there are limits to what they may feel able to express in a public setting, despite reassurances of anonymity. And there are also limits to what influence their views may have in a context where the government appears not to be interested in dialogue or negotiation at the present time. But it remains important that the perspectives of those most effective should be heard nonetheless.
Okay, I think it's also good to bring out this point that people sometimes referring to the collage method that we use particularly, people worry that it requires some special skill or resources. This is actually not the case, because the interesting thing with this method is that unlike maybe interviews which might require some language, some level of command for some language, the collage, we saw that you could have very elderly people in the room alongside really young people, middle age, men and women in the same room, going about their collage without any difficulty, and that it was a kind of liberating. So this is actually one of the limitations that has often been raised as far as this is concerned, and but we didn't really see that that was a problem at all from the experience with using collage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we move now to the questions. There's a question for Shona. Would really love to hear more about your experience of entering academia after having been an activist or advocate for so long, and how being both in and of the city you are researching influences your academic work and practice and your experience of being in academia. Peter is the one asking, he's guessing you are not a part of the communities that you work with or for, but you have lived alongside them for a very long period of time.
Thanks. That's a really great question. And yes, Winnipegger is a word. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it's fairly liberating to come to academia after having done a whole, pile of other things, and really primarily being an activist and advocate for the issues in my community, because I don't really trouble myself with some of the issues that academics tend to get caught up in. And I appreciate, the comments people make about the universities incentivizing particular, types of activities. Fortunate to live in a fairly small city and work at a small university that is a little bit more open to the kind of work that I do. I also work in a department that is actually removed from the main campus, situated in the inner city, purposely there to try to make university more accessible to folks who otherwise would feel extremely intimidated. So I am, in the community and have developed some really long-term relationships with folks. And so, I've learned more from my my work in the community, I would say, and from the people that I do research with than I have through any of my academic training. And what I see is that I've got some skills that I can bring, and I just use them to do what it is that people feel is needed.
Thank you. So this is a question to all the speakers. How do you deal or tackle with the issue of non-participation as possibly a way of articulation for some members of the community, seen as not a homogeneous group, of their self-determination? It all relates to the speakers of the first roundtable on who gets to participate, how and why.
Well, you can't force people to participate. I mean, we in the work that we have done, we've tried to have as wide a range of people as possible, though that there are also limitations by the nature of a conflict situation in terms of who you can reach. But certainly, we would not want to present a homogeneous view of any community. There are going to be various perspectives on the conflict, its causes, its impact, its ways and means of possible resolution. And I think the collage making sessions have reflected many such differences in perspective.
One particularly interesting example was a participant that was a bit reluctant at the beginning in Limbe, in a collage session we held in a town called Limbe. And this was actually someone who was not actually invited, but who was captured, who was attracted by the materials that he saw being taken into the room that we were using for the collage session. And so he came and stood by the door, and then we thought he had actually been invited by one of the local leaders that were involved in recruiting participants. And so we asked him, do you want to take part? And he was like, he wasn't very sure, but when he actually saw the activity unfold, he jumped in and he picked his brush and started dipping it in paint and doing his own board. And in the end, he left very happy to have taken part in the exercise. And so it's just to say that unlike other methods, what we see, for instance, with interviews where the process sometimes feels a bit rigid, where you're moving from, you try to sometimes move from one question to the other. The collage works in a way that people do not actually perceive, even as a researcher, you do not perceive any possible harm. And so non-participation becomes something that is really, really unlikely or to pose a problem when you are using the collage method to collect data. And we definitely didn't really experience this. The elderly, for instance, we also saw in a session in another town, Yaoundé, that some of those who were very elderly did not seem to understand how we were getting them to start doing what maybe they feel is reserved in that context for younger people. But in the end, you needed to see how much fun they had with the whole exercise. They sort of enjoyed it even more than the younger people, and left really happy and hoping that we could actually still have a session like that. So it's important, again, like I said, to really reflect on context and to use the kind of research approach that would enable you really to capture that interest and to avoid that problem of non-participation. And when the right approaches that suit the context are chosen, that problem can actually be limited to quite a good extent.
Thank you. So I think the next question I will ask Hetty and Shauna to answer, but it's a question to all. It says, to Zainab's great point in the last panel about different ways of sharing the knowledge beyond the academic article, and Lata's point about single authorship, what do you think decolonizing knowledge means for the way we think about authorship, ownership, and who gets credited for the knowledge and how it is shared? And what do you do in your own research, especially within participatory methodologies? I think we can't truly think of only the academic scholar as the author.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. I mean, I think it's a really important thing to think about. I think with the kind of outcomes of these projects, it's something that we perhaps haven't gone far enough in terms of interrogating, you know, in particular, how we might think about kind of co-publishing, and I definitely agree that this idea of the kind of singular academic scholar as the kind of author of the knowledge arising from the projects is really problematic, and it's something that we have talked about at times and kind of been grappling with, but it's not something we've really kind of dealt with yet in terms of collaboratively authoring, in terms of thinking about how we kind of attribute the knowledge arising from the project. I mean, one thing to say is that this resource that I mentioned before, the practitioner resource, is very much a kind of collaborative output, and in particular visibility had a really key role in shaping that, but also through these workshops that we ran with people who took part in the project and their kind of input into the resource. So that was a more kind of collaborative output perhaps than the kind of more conventional articles and so on.
Yeah, I could just say that I strongly believe in co-authoring with people that we're doing research with in the community as much as we can. And I know it can be challenging. So, I mean, I recently, a couple of years ago, put out a book on sort of some of the stories of community-based research here in our community. And almost all of those chapters are co-authored with women from the inner city that we really sort of guided our research. And I'm working on a project right now that all of the chapters in the book will be co-authored with an academic and then elders in the community who are really, you know, it's their knowledge, right? They're telling the stories, but they're not writers. So we're committed to ensuring that we co-author those chapters to recognize that being an author isn't just putting pen to paper, it's bringing your knowledge to the project. So again, respecting the Indigenous folks who are telling the stories of the work that they've done in the community. So I very much believe in that model, and I know that it can be challenging for academics that are expected, you know, to publish in certain ways. But if we are committed to this process of decolonization, I think we have to find ways to do this.
So the last question is open to all. How do you respond to the critique of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and Tuck and Yang that Freirean approaches have obscured indigenous knowledge and have made a metaphor of decolonization by heavily based on the discourse of enlightenment, that's critical consciousness and the rhetoric of salvation?
Okay, I mean, I can start, though this is not a critique that I'm familiar with. I'm not familiar with this critique of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith or critique of Paulo Freire. I suppose I would just say, in terms of, you know, Paulo Freire wrote over 50 years ago. His work has been incredibly influential. It's also influential in participatory action research, which Joanna mentioned, Fowles Border and democratizing knowledge, all sort of very Freirean. So I don't think it's really my place to engage in critique of Freire's work. I can say a little bit more about the previous question, and you know, very much endorse what others said there, but and the importance of going beyond the academic article. Like Sean, I came to academia late after being involved in as more of an activist for people's rights in the UK, and it's important that outputs are varied, and certainly for the Cameroon project, we're working closely with NGOs who are actively involved in the conflict zones, human rights organizations, women's organizations, and we will work with them and write with them, discuss content at sort of consultative dialogue workshops, also write policy briefs, newspaper articles, blogs, etc. All that is certainly as important as the academic article, or more important, should I say.
Now, I think I want to say something about that too, but starting with the question on the Freirean approaches. I think that the Freirean approaches are in a sense in essence about co-creation of knowledge. And so I would say that I do not really understand why this is considered considered here as being a metaphor that is obscuring indigenous knowledge and making a metaphor of decolonization. I don't quite get that, because to me, the fact that these approaches focus on co-creation of knowledge makes them decolonizing, among other things. This follows, this links up with the other question that wasn't really put to us, but which I think is good to say something, speak to, which is that in our research, we actually, in participatory research, we're not only looking at the members of the community, but we also try to work with people that could be in the event where you have limited resources. You might also work with people who can be representatives of those communities. And we do both. We actually work directly with community members themselves, but we also work with people who can be qualified as representatives, possible representatives of those communities. And we involve the representatives of the communities in all stages of the process, which means that we actually involve them in the conception stage of the research. They looked at the proposal, and they have been involved in the data collection. So the collage making sessions, they were involved. They went beyond recruiting the participants. They were involved in actually facilitating the collage sessions, and they are also involved in the analysis part of the work. So at the end of it, if it is, as long as they consent, we do not see why they wouldn't be co-authors. There's no reason why they wouldn't be co-authors of any research product from this particular study, because they have actually participated very fully in the research. And again, like I said, it is the same thing that we could have done with other community members, but this to me is subject to consent of the person. And in research around conflict, what we do know is that sometimes it is too sensitive to actually mention people's names in the research paper, and this might be the only reason why you don't get some community members figuring as co-authors in a paper. But otherwise, those that are representatives, as in the case of our research, would most likely be co-authors in some of the papers that we actually publish. Thank you.
Can I just add one final thought to all of this? I was just going to actually put it in the chat. I also feel that, we need to consider what our long-term relationship is with people that we're doing participatory research with. I feel that we owe it to folks who are, really contributing. We're doing work together, and hopefully there will have, it will benefit all of us. But I just feel that the process doesn't end with the publication. It's not just, putting together a report and then, we go, okay, on to the next project. We develop relationships with people, they trust us, and we have the capacity to contribute more. And we need to have ongoing commitment to the process of decolonization, if that is, what our, towards social justice aims beyond just the research process.
I agree. I mean, I think one of the things we found in the work in Sri Lanka is that the kind of structure of short-term funded academic projects it means that the kind of sustainability of the work and also of our relationship with the participants is kind of dependent on quite kind of lumpy in a way project-based funding. And so exactly as you're saying, Sean, that this kind of feels really important that we maintain these relationships long-term, and that we also enables the wrong word, but help support the sustainability of the practices so that they're not dependent on UK-based research funding in order for the work itself to continue. So just to say, I agree, and that's something we're kind of constantly grappling with.
We have come to the end of today's session. So I'll seize this opportunity on behalf of Gordon, Joanna, and myself to thank you very much for your time and for engagement in this conference. Thank you very much.